Sapphire LensFlare is able to create some beautiful, realistic flares, or more stylized ones that can also be art directed. One of its major strengths is this library of flare presets, handcrafted by a group of talented artists and me, Ben Brownlee, for Boris FX. Now, I do love a good lens flare, and over the years I've created up a ton of flares based off of either realistic lenses or gone deep into my brain. But most importantly, I've gathered some techniques to stop these flares from looking boring and mechanical and helping them to just come alive. Let's start in the Sapphire Flare Designer. And I'm going to start with a preset, but I'm not going to start with a full preset like this. Let's get rid of all of these. Under presets, I have these things called components. So these are small building blocks that I can use to help build up my own custom flares easily, or in this case I'm just going to use this to build up some reference images. So I'm going to use a hotspot, and I'm going to use a reference element down at the bottom. Come back to those in a sec. So now I want to talk to you about how we start to set up this interplay of different lens elements. Let's come in and I'll add another spot here. Now, when I'm laying out my elements, the position is by far the most important place to start. By default, position is set to 0.5. And this means that the element is set halfway between my hotspot and the pivot point. If I change the position to 1, it's going to sit directly on the hotspot and be counted as a hotspot. If I set the position to 0, it's going to sit right at the pivot point, which means as we move the hotspot around, it's not really going to be doing any movement except for some of the sort of trigger animation. We can even take this position negative. So if I set this to -1, you can see that we have this now following the hotspot as a actual mirror to what the hotspot's doing. Now I can even take this beyond the realm of the sliders. So instead of going from 1 to -1, let's take this to -2. So now the movement here is double the distance between the hotspot, and it sort of moves faster, but all in line. You can see it's still moving in line. If I had a lot of spots here, the movement that we get from these is kind of mechanical, but there is a relationship between those spots. Let's get rid of that. We also have ways of offsetting this. So we can offset purely in the X and Y. So if I offset that, actually, let's set that to 1 so it's sat right next to the hotspot. We can do the same thing if we offset Y just for vertical. We have one more thing for the offset, which is the offset off axis. So let's take a little look here. Let's move that out. So now we can see that this sort of is offset from the hotspot, but it has a different relationship to the pivot point here. We can see where the pivot works. This is kind of good for certain lenses where the optics aren't 100% perfect, and maybe it has just like a little speck somewhere that's just offset and just catches something there. We use this quite a bit in some of the presets as well. So with that in mind, let's get to the meat of this and look at the different offset modes. So offset mode normal is what we've seen here. If I go to horizontal stretch and I start moving this around, nothing really changes at this time. And the reason for that is that horizontal stretch and vertical stretch only work when we have certain offsets set in as well. So offset X and offset Y. And it's one of those things that you can only really see when we start to have multiple elements together. And that's really the whole point of this, is that we're subtly changing the relationship between these spot elements to give it a more kind of natural feel and less of a sort of old-fashioned CG lens flare feel. And for this, I'm going to change the color of this spot to, okay, let's do a red on this one. Okay, let's duplicate this. And I'm going to change this to cyan. We end up with two opposing colors, and we sort of end up with a nice gray in between when they're added together. Perfect. Let's bring my hotspot onto the center. And I'm going to change the offset X, the horizontal offset, just a little bit. 0.01. It's very small. And let's see what happens now as I move my hotspot around. So as I move that over, you can start seeing we're getting some chromatic aberration happening here. And the reason for that is that this horizontal stretch is actually multiplying that offset. So the closer I get to the center, the less offset there is. And the further I get away from the center, or the pivot point, it's not the center, it doesn't necessarily have to be the center. The further I get away from the pivot point, the more that offset increases. So we can see here, we can get some quite nice chromatic aberration. We could also do magenta green, and we just build up a little bit of chromatic aberration as it moves towards the edges. And that's a really nice sort of subtle thing. And we can do the same vertically. If I change vertical stretch, obviously nothing is going to happen here. Do you know why? Well, of course you know why. Because I have no offset in the Y. And as soon as I offset Y, let's take that a little bit further. You can see we can get like quite a nice separation between these elements here. And there's some good usage of this technique in some of my favorite presets, including something like, you know, call your girlfriend with the streaks. One other offset mode that I like and have used liberally is the fixed mode as well. So what this does is that it only operates via the offset X and Y. So it can give us a fixed point so that we know that something is going to happen, or glare is going to happen when the hotspot reaches a certain area. Is I've used this just to create a nice little edge ring in here. So if we take a look at the blue edge, just solo that selection. As we move the hotspot away from the center, we get this nice little subtle edge here. In fact, it's so subtle I've had to turn the brightness up a lot. And like all of my favorite flares, like it's really that sort of subtle interplay between lots of different elements that kind of makes this fun and interesting for me. And that's why I was really excited when we had new offset modes in Sapphire 2026.5 and above, which are horizontal follow, vertical follow, and custom follow. So if I turn this to horizontal follow now, and I'll change my position to anything other than 1, because 1 is always going to follow along with the hotspot itself. So now we have horizontal follow. We get that same sort of stretching that we were getting with the horizontal stretch, but we don't have to set an offset. So it's just working off the hotspot's position. So we have this at the center. I move this up and down. Everything stays, you know, locked together. And then as I move this further and further away, we get that multiplying effect happening with the position. Let's see what happens when I bring this in as well. So these both the horizontal follow. So now we'll always have that same sort of relationship to the hotspot, but I can make these nice fast movements as the hotspot moves away from the center. And that's horizontal follow. Vertical follow does the same thing. It sort of works out it's working out that relationship, that ratio between those elements. So this is extremely useful for fast moving streaks, or if we're working on kind of anamorphic style lenses, where we get those, you know, those sort of telltale big bright blue streaks. And if I use the complete memory preset here, you can see we get these nice fast wavy streaks walking through or moving through the screen. And lastly, we have the option for you to have complete control over how this works. So with these custom percentages set to 0, it's going to work exactly like the normal works. with this set to 100, it's going to work exactly like horizontal follow or vertical follow. Very nice. But we can mix and match as well. Actually, I'll set both of these positions to 0.5 so we can get a bit more of a compare and contrast. So we can see as I move the hotspot around, the relationship between the hotspot and this point is going to follow my custom values over there. So you can use this for some sort of highly stylized looks, but if you're going for the realistic flares, you're probably not going to have custom X and Y be something like that, for example, because that's just going to look a little bit strange. It's not how light would generally interact with the lens itself. So as you can tell, there's a huge amount of flexibility when it comes to designing flares in the flare designer. And this is what I love about Sapphire's LensFlare, is the fact that we can art direct all of these very, very simply. And, you know, if you're going for a realistic measured lens, you can create those looks very successfully. Or if you're going for something that's a bit more stylized, then, you know, you have all that full artistic control that you might possibly want. And I always recommend, if you are just starting to get into the idea of creating your own lens flares, definitely start with a preset and then pick apart what makes that flare attractive to you. And then just see what that interplay between the different elements is. And then you can, you know, integrate that into your own flares. If you want to hear me wax lyrical about lens flares even more, then let me know down in the comments below, where you can also ask any questions that you have. I will post links to our Discord channel and our forums in the description. And of course, if you haven't tried out Sapphire's LensFlare yet, you can head over to borisfx.com and grab yourself a free trial.